Rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of the Most Merciful, thank you all for joining us. We have three exceptionally extraordinarily inspiring women who will be speaking to us. We are very, very, very excited to have you with us. And as with every program that we do at Strive, we begin in the most auspicious manner with a few verses from the holiest of holiest books. I'm now going to invite Hilmi to please recite a few verses before we start.
Assalamu alaikum. Today I will be reciting 10 ayahs of Surah Qiyamah and the meaning. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا أقسم بيوم القيامة. I do call to witness the resurrection day. ولا أقسم بالنفس اللوامة. And I do call to witness the self-reproaching spirit. أيحسب الإنسان أن لن نجمع عظامه. Does man think that we cannot assemble his bones? بلى قادرين على أن نسوي بنانه. Nay, we are able to put together in perfect order the very tips of his fingers. بل يريد الإنسان ليفجر أمامه. But man wishes to do wrong even in the time in front of him. يسأل أيان يوم القيامة. He questions, when is the day of resurrection? فإذا برق البصر. At once, when the sight is dazed. وخسف القمر. And the moon is buried in darkness. وجمع الشمس والقمر. And the sun and moon are joined together. يقول الإنسان يومئذ أين المفر. That day will man say, where is the refuge? صدق الله العظيم. جزاك الله خير for listening.
Barakallah fiqh. Thank you very, very much for that. So as we start, I think it is very important and very pertinent that I introduce you the two organizations that are actually organizing this very, very important and, if I may say, very timely event. So the one that I'd like to start with is friends at the South Asia Solidarity Group, which is an anti-imperialist, anti-racist organization based in Britain. As an organization, they are committed to supporting, publicizing, and building solidarity with people's struggles for justice and democracy and against exploitation, gender and caste-based oppression, imperialism, war, and the so-called war on terror in countries of South Asia. They have been a vanguard and an exceptionally visionary organization in organizing quite a lot of the protests that the UK has seen. And the most recent ones were the ones against the very, very discriminatory citizenship and refugee laws in India that several hundreds and thousands of people took part. The other organization also that I'd like to introduce you and was very proud to be part of the many, many activities that the South Asia Solidarity Group took part and of which I am a volunteer with is Thrive UK. We are a British Muslim socio-cultural and advocacy organization. We're affiliated to the Muslim Council of Britain. As a multicultural organization, appropriately representative of Britain, our members are from all walks of life, professionals, students, academics, and full-time workers. And our volunteers organize events where we have international speakers to speak about Islamophobia, racism, climate change, quite a lot of the current insights into everything that's got to do with the events in Uyghur and Palestine, the refugee crisis worldwide. There are several events that we do. And here we actually speak about a very, very important subject, which is, the demolition of the Babri Masjid on the 6th of December 1992 was an act of terror in a long line of sustained attacks with state complicity against the Muslims of India. Now, this watershed moment reset mob audacity, state encouragement, and near emasculation and indifference of judicial checks. And with the Citizenship Act passed on the 11th of December 2019 in association with the NRC, we saw enactment of laws that allow state to, systemically discriminate, marginalize, and criminalize Muslims. So there is a concerted effort to legalize hate and erase the collective memory of the betrayal of the Muslim population and the massacres that were orchestrated by several conspirators to alienate Muslim citizens and polarize the country. So our moral responsibility starts from identifying it, understanding it, and then acting against it. We see this as an opportunity to speak, to citizen champions people who are with us today, who've risked their lives against mob lust, right-wing hypocrisy, and pliant and cheerleading media, and state complicity to stamp out the scourge. So I'm actually going to start with our speakers, and the way that we will do, we'll have the three speakers who will be speaking to us for around 10 to 15 minutes. After which we will open for question and answers. Please do use the chat options. I will try to ask as many questions as possible for those who are, you can either put it in the messages just to the hosts or to the panel, but please do write them and we'll be hoping to answer as many. We're expecting to end the event in an hour and a half. So let's try to make as much of it today. Our first speaker is Safura Dagar, who, as all of us know, was a student activist at Jamia Millia University. The personal cost for her activism has been documented, and we have read through sheer courage and how she has inspired several people and showed the brutality of state clampdown. We all know she was charged on the stringent anti-terror law, the Unlawful Activities and Prevention Act, or the UAPA, and was thrown behind bars in 2020. And all of this despite lack of evidence. And she's shared her ordeal with several international media that we also know. And we are very, very happy that you have joined us. And we are eagerly awaiting to hear from you about everything that has happened since. And we'd also like to know what is it that we are yet to know about what happened and that you can share with us. Over to you, Safura.
Assalamu alaikum to everybody. First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. Congratulations to you all, for all stakeholders, for making this event possible. Hello to Kaval and Sarabjeet. I will most probably be staying to listen to you. The topic that we are discussing today is from Babri to CAA. And, it's coincidental that, I was having this discussion today with somebody who's close to me. And we were talking about how, we are just frozen in time. I was talking personally, but, my friend was even felt, he was just, he echoed my thoughts, basically. He said, I also feel like we were talking about Jamia violence, we were talking about when uniformed terrorists basically broke into our campus and, vandalized, brutalized, lathi charged indiscriminately, tear gassed, and got away with it. After 2 years, there is no accountability and it's normalized. And this is not the first time that it happened. In 2008 also, infamously known as the Butler House encounter, the police forces entered with such impunity and they got away with it. But that time, it was still the residential locality which was again, after the incident, it was criminalized. But, to break into a central university, where students are studying, into the libraries, into the washrooms was something, I would say that we were naive to not, for us, it was unimaginable. So, I was just discussing with my friend, and I was confiding in him that how, it just feels like yesterday. I am just so frozen in that time, and I cannot, I cannot fathom moving on from it. I mean, and the sense of betrayal and abandonment that I feel, and he echoed my feelings, my emotions, and our thoughts. And then we went on to discuss history, that how since the day that India got independence, I would say, I think there has been a feeling of betrayal, and and even before India got independence. I mean, it starts with I can refer to very casual, misnomers, like referring to Muslims as guests in their own country, in our own country. And I mean, I can go on to mention a lot of things, but also the fact that, blaming us for the partition of India, putting the entire blame on the Muslims for the partition of India. And, nowadays it has become like everyday harassment, everyday demonization, everyday criminalization, from selling bangles to selling meat, to even existing with a skull cap or in a hijab on the streets of the country. Everything has been criminalized, and it has been demonized right now. So, I mean, and we cannot look at, so when I was looking at it in isolation, and then I kind of related it with how historically this has been the feelings of not just me, but so many others like me. And I mean, even after, if you would see the Babri Masjid demolition, which was, again, as Naeem Bhai said, it was an act of terror which was committed in full daylight, with the impunity of the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive all combined into one. And the sense of betrayal that, kind of, sorry, excuse that. The sense of betrayal that, that followed after that, and I think it has continued to haunt us, because after 28 years, all of those people who were involved in it, and it's an open, it's not even open secret. It's like it was an open spectacle. I think anybody who was, who was active in those times would count those people on their fingers, who were responsible for the, the demolition, the extrajudicial demolition of the Babri Masjid. The extrajudicial criminal demolition of the Babri Masjid, everybody, I mean, all of us even sitting here would have all of those names on our fingertips, but still, on 30th November 2020, they were all acquitted of all charges, and the court said that there was no pre-planned conspiracy. On the other hand, I mean, when after the Babri Masjid demolition, what we saw was massacre of Muslims all over India, and so basically, and there has been no accountability for that. There have been no justice for that, most importantly, and there has been abandonment from all sides. Be it, I mean, especially if we see electorally, be it the Congress and of course the BJP, but the Congress also, there has been complete abandonment. I mean, I can go on and count so many incidents. Matlab, there is 2002 Gujarat riots, referred to as riots, but Gujarat anti-Muslim pogrom. We see no justice, we see no reconciliation. 2013 Muzaffarnagar, it was very recent news that, there have been no convictions, and all of those people they are completely scot-free, and all of those people who were, they were survivors or who were victims, they still remember their ordeal as it was just yesterday, but there has been no justice for that. And and there are so many things in between, but I'm just mentioning things that I mean, all of those things are struck with me, but things that I can just pick on top of my head, actually. And then if we come to the CAA, I think the Citizenship Amendment Act, the anti-CAA movement, was not just about the CAA bill. I think it was a culmination of all of the injustices, basically, that we have patiently undergone solely so as to save the secular fabric of the country, as if all the all the responsibility is on the minority to save the secular fabric of the country. Because as soon as we've always been told by all quarters of, I would say, even the civil society, that do not I mean, in the sense that, have patience, have faith in the judiciary, and, all of these, I feel, rhetorical things. And we have not really asserted our identity, because we have felt that empowers the communal narrative. But the fact of the matter is that even after all of these years of not asserting our identity, not, I would say, not demanding our rights, I think the nation today is more communalized than ever. There is the hatred that, that has been building up against the Muslims since so long. It has been fanned by political parties. It has been nurtured by Hindutva and right-wing groups. And it has also been nurtured, so to say. And the people say that, they are the haters and they are in the minority. But I would say that somebody is voting for this government. And that is why this government, which only talks about mandir, and which only talks about hate against Muslims, Christians, and other minorities, is still in power. Pakistanis are not voting for them. Afghanistanis are not voting for them. Indians are voting for them. Indians are voting them to power, right? So if you say that, the haters are less in number, I have a very hard time believing you, because we currently see that, the majority of people in India are radicalized and have lost faith in secularism. And it's like, openly people are not in favor of a secular nation. And I see that every day. I see it happening every day. I think this was all that, that culminated in the anti-CAA movement, where the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was also anti-Muslim, but it was also anti-constitutional, but it was also anti-Muslim. And as against advices by many quarters of the civil society, I would like to say that, yes, it was anti-Muslim. And I will want to highlight that point itself, because that is the point that, is threatening my existence. of course, the going against the CEA is anti-constitutional. It does threaten my existence. It threatens everybody's existence. But why I am more outraged by the CEA is because it immediately threatens my existence. It is again on top of the piles of betrayals and abandonment that I have seen over the years. This is the candy on top of that, you know. And however, and I have the right to say enough is enough, and no, I am not going to take it any further. You know, I think that sentiment was also echoed in the wider Muslim community, as per, you know, as being part of the movement, as you know, I was able to see for myself and understand from the movement that, you know, these sentiments about identity, about being able to, pray freely in the country, about being able to roam around in a hijab without being looked at as a terrorist, about being able to protest without, kind of proving my nationality again and again by holding the national flag in one hand and the constitution in other hand. It was all of that, you know, combined together. And I think this spirit was, you know, common in the among the anti-CAA protesters, you know. The fact of the matter is also that, you know, how any kind of assertion of rights by Muslims in the country is, current is always being seen as a threat to national security. You know, the idea of, there are in February, I guess, in ending January, I think Sharjeel Imam was arrested, and he was arrested for calling a chakka jam, you know, and the fact that, you know, chakka jam, basically that is a form of protest, or the model of protest that India has sustained since years. I mean, it's not new. When this government was in opposition, I would say they have resorted to chakka jams all over the country. And, if you see the 70s movement all over, and even, you know, in the India against corruption, you would see this form of protesting happening. But when Muslims want to do this kind of protest, it is then seen as a threat to national security, basically. Peaceful anti-CAA protests were basically, crushed by way of a massacre, you know, I would say massacre in the Northeast Delhi, which I believe was pre-planned by the government of India. And the 2/3 of those who, you know, lost their lives in February 2020 were Muslims. But if you see, today, we being the survivors, we being the victims, we facing the loss of life, livelihood, everything, we are also the ones who are, criminalized, who are the accused. You know, we are also the ones who are going to the courts every week, every month, fighting battles that we shouldn't have, apart from also fighting emotional battles, apart from also, bearing the sense of loss and betrayal and abandonment. We are also trying to, prove that, we were the victim, or we were the survivors, and we are not criminals, or we are not terrorists. At the time of the anti-CAA movement, I was a student in Jamia. I have talked about this at length, about how initially, I recently gotten married. I was an MPhil student. I was busy with my coursework, so my participation in the anti-CAA movement in Jamia was like, okay, there is a protest, let me go and participate, because that's how I have been since so many years, in the campus, outside the campus. But I think the 15th December was pivotal, in the sense that how could you come into the university and unleash terror on students, innocent students who are sitting and studying in the library, and causing lifelong damage to students, that I think was the pivotal moment. It was also the turning point of the CA movement. But unfortunately, because of COVID, I feel that the CA movement was called off by the protesters itself. And how, under the garb of the pandemic, the government resorted to a witch hunt of activists and students and of protesters. And we know of very few cases. There is, of course, the famous DRC, which is wrongly, I would say, known as the Delhi Riots Conspiracy. But, and there are 21 students and activists. Usme se there are 2 students. I mean, we were 4 from Jamia Millia Islamia. 2 of us got bail. Miran and Shafa continue to be in jail. Sharjeel Imam continues to be in jail. And local activists like Gulfisha, Tasleem, Shadab, they continue to be, in jail. Khalid Saifi is in jail. Umar Khalid is in jail. And these are the people who have given their lives in activism and in defending human rights, in seeking accountability for the government. And this is how they are being paid. They are being witch hunted and tortured. Basically, this is pure revenge. That is how it actually paid out. And the real conspirators, the real people behind the Muslim massacre in the Northeast Delhi roam about freely without even an FIR. And recently the court has given some additional 2 months or 3 months for to the Delhi police. I mean, it's been 1.5 years now, but the police has not been able to arrest them, even when we have proof openly available of their complicity. This is the state in which so the final pillar in a democracy that Muslims have always had faith on has always been the judiciary. And today I see that that faith, I see dwindling, and I see but I don't see hopelessness, because as a community, as people who are being literally hunted every day in the country, we don't have the luxury of being hopeless. Hope is our only, it is our only survival. It is what keeps us going. It is what is keeping me going. In fact, I have 5 FIRs on me. I go to court about 5 times in a month at least. And yeah, it becomes difficult because you can't think about anything else in your life apart from legal strategy, lawyers, charge sheets, stages of trials, courts, and that's how your life becomes. So it becomes, and from just being a student who would maybe have gone to do a PhD abroad, or maybe just sort of professorship at some central university or something, my life has completely shifted trajectories. It's like it's completely different, and I have no control over it, most importantly. And this is not just me. This is thousands of people and thousands of protesters who live their life in fear, because the witch hunt is not ended. All India's top investigating agencies are still, there is so much of surveillance and, everything that you feel so unsafe in your own house, right? Lastly, this is my understanding of how as a Muslim, how my situation has basically worsened from Babri to the CAA, right? But, I do see a ray of, again, as I said, that I am hopeful, and I do see a ray of hope. And recently, I know Kanwal can talk a bit more about it. Also, the farmers' protest and how the government had to, bend in the end and repeal the farm laws. And it just shows the the power of resistance, the power of struggle. And if only we could understand, the importance of secularism, or the importance of eradicating communalism, eradicating hate in a democracy, I think we will be able to struggle, we would be able to resistance. And no government is powerful enough to basically sustain in spite of a mass resistance. And that is the need of the hour. It is the need to basically forge larger solidarities, to understand that the fascism is a threat to not just one community, not just Muslims, but it is a threat to the Christians, it is a threat to the Sikhs, it is a threat to the Dalits, and it is a threat to the Hindus themselves. Recently what I saw was, on CNN News 18, there is a Akhand Bharat ka map, which is going from Afghanistan to I don't know from where, it was this much. I mean, it covered half of South Asia. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to start a war in South Asia? So, I mean, if you see it like that, it is a concern of the entire world. What is happening in India? It needs to be really talked about. It needs to be highlighted. It needs to be red signaled all over the world, because it is not just limited to India. It can pose a threat to the entire world. And I see the passing of the anti-Islamophobia bill in the US as it's a good step, and I feel that international advocacy in this respect would be really appreciated. And of course, a lot of USCIRF, and they are highlighting how religious freedom in India has been really going down, and it's really bad. And there was also this proposal to make India a nation of concern, but it was rejected. But I would say that if concerted efforts in this regard is very, very important right now to basically stop the impending, I would say, genocide of not just Muslims, but minorities in the country. I guess I've taken too long. Thank you so much. Naeem.
No, thank you very, very, very much, Safura. I mean, the message for activists is very, very loud and clear. I think if there is anything that we have learned from everything that we've seen and that we've had the opportunity to be part of, Islamophobia is never because of what people do. Islamophobia is because of what people are. So, irrespective of anything, it is a hate phenomenon on a completely different level. So, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. Hopefully, in the Q&A sessions, we'll also have opportunity to discuss things like allies, real allies, and false equivalences that actually try and derail the momentum that a lot of activists have, especially with asserting their faith in particular. I'm going to now invite Kalpreet Kaur, who, as everybody knows, was the president of the All India Students Association for Delhi, and is a very, very noted human rights activist, a political activist, and as a lawyer with the Human Rights Law Network. We all know her as a very vocal critic of the Citizenship Amendment Act. And we're proud that, as someone who's been a very forefront against this very sectarian and divisive act, that she is part of our event today. We invite you to the event, and the floor is now really open to you. Kalpreet, over to you.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure listening to Safura. Let me say that it was an honor to be here with her. And it is her courage. It is people like Safura, people like Miran that we have seen. I mean, Miran, as you were talking about Miran, it was all there, the protests that we had collectively. And it's not only CA, but the other protests, universities protests. So it's all there. And I really hope that we can have them all out very soon, as we had Natasha, Devangna, and Asif, who were also the 3 other students who were jailed. And I think Safura has mostly covered the trajectory of the current situation in India right now. And there can be no better person than her and the students of Jamia who can tell you about the CA. I mean, I don't see myself actually as a person who really was there doing, I was there on the streets, I was there in solidarity, but these are the leaders, the people who are in jail, Umar, all of them were the leaders, and Safura, they are our leaders, the students of AMU, Aligarh Muslim University, who were the first one who started protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act. So these are the people that we all look up to, and we must look up to in India and also in other parts of the world, because these are the people who are actually at the forefronts fighting the genocidal government, fighting the Hindutva regime. And so, I mean, when Safura was actually talking, and she was talking about the judiciary and also the Babri verdict and how the desecration of Babri Masjid. So one thing that actually clicked me, and I had not thought of it before, but it is this: when I see 90s, the period of 90s in India, I'm actually reminded of what Dr. Ambedkar had written, that Hindu society is actually a collection of caste. And when I see Babri Masjid demolition, I also see during the 90s, there was another movement going on. That was the movement emphasizing on differences. That was the Mandal Commission. Mandal Commission was appointed in 70s, and Mandal Commission came up with this report, which was implemented later on, that said that more than 52% of Indian population belongs to the other backward communities. And they actually came up with the categorizations that you are socially, you are educationally, you are backward. And thus reservation was also extended. 27% reservation was extended to the other backward communities, other than the reservation that we have for the Dalit and the tribal people in our country. So why am I talking about this Mandal Commission is because, as we also note when we try to understand the period of Babri, is that 90s is actually a very important period for the country like India, because in 90s you have the people who are at the margins, people who are said to be Hindus and incomplete Hindu as a monolithic identity. They are actually saying that we are at the margins. We are not actually on the top positions. So they are actually demanding that we be given the special preference, we be given the reservation that we rightly deserve. So this is the OBC movement happening in India. And then the other side, we see after 1 year that there is a grand effort to project that Hindu identity is one monolithic identity. And to present that monolithic identity, you need to have that one, as Safura also said in the beginning, that you need to have that one common enemy, and that common enemy in our country, especially since the birth of RSS, as they have been writing in their own writings, their pracharaks have been saying it's the Muslim community, which is always at the target and who are at the receiving end. So this is how I see the Babri Masjid, and I try to understand it in this way, that this was the one this was this one period when completely erasing the constitution, completely overriding all the law, whatever law and order that we have in our country, there is this, the goons and the so-called Hindutva activists, the terrorists, under the garb of all the religious, you can say, symbols, etc. They are the one who actually went ahead and desecrated Babri Masjid. And then I see the verdict that came by the Supreme Court of the country. At the one side, the Supreme Court said that the desecration was actually illegal. And you see how contradictory the judgment was. And at the other hand, they are saying that you construct a grand temple at that place. And then they're giving some land, and they're saying that we'll give some land to the Sunni the Waqf board also to, parallelly construct a masjid at some other place. So admitting, the Supreme Court is also admitting in what one stance in the judgment that, okay, the desecration was illegal, but at the other hand, they're also saying that since we went through the judgment in detail, the judgment came when the CA protests were also happening. I remember, I think it was in the beginning of 2020 when the judgment had come out. 2000, if I'm not wrong, it was 2020, and it's full of speculation. So there's a topmost court of the country writing a judgment based on speculation, speculating that once there was a temple based on this historical text or that historical text, whatever. So this is this is how the Babri Masjid, we start seeing the trajectory of Indian politics. But I also want to give I want to go back to the part of the topic, which is Babri to CA fighting fascism in India. And I'm actually interested when I look at how do you really fight fascism? I mean, you fight fascism on road. And what is fascism? It's actually completely suppressing of dissent that I see in India, and completely suppressing one identity and in India, which is the Muslim community. And Sapura also mentioned the farmers' protest, and she also very well, she went into the question of identity. And I actually remember this so clearly, that when students of Jamia were protesting during the CA movement, I think she remembers it very well. And there's a opposition leader, Congress leader, who was invited. I don't know if I should mention it here or not, but I'm just going ahead. I'm mentioning it because, okay, whatever. So Shashi Tharoor is the Congress leader. He was invited, and many people were very concerned. There were all sort of concerns that, you don't raise your slogans. You should not raise slogans which are the religious slogans. And since I'm not a Muslim and I'm a Sikh, so I was like, okay, what is this slogan? I started asking my friends, what is this slogan? And Tera Mera Rishta Kya? What does that mean? That was the slogan that the students were raising. And one of my friends actually explained to me very well that it's, the problem lies that the majority community of the country does not understand, and they have never tried to understand what goes into the minds of the minority and what is the other identity. And you always see everything from your own majoritarian lens, and you get uncomfortable when you see a slightest of assertion from the minorities. And I understood at that time. And when I see and at that time also, I saw there was a lot of, during that time, even people from the civil society, even I would go ahead and say people from within the left communities were also very uncomfortable seeing that. But the students of Jamia were unfazed, and they said that no, the protest, actually we should be thankful to them, because they were also protesting to safeguard the constitution of the country, the constitution which is supposed to protect them, the constitution which is supposed to provide justice, equality, fraternity to everyone. And they were the people who were receiving the lathis, they were the people who were injuring their heads, they were the people who were being admitted in the hospitals, they are the ones who are right now in jails, and they are the ones who are guiding the constitution, which is a secular constitution. And even with that, they were not allowed to say their own slogans by the people also who were there in the protest. So why I'm mentioning this, and now I want to go back to the farmers' protest, is that you see, now in the farmers' movement, we can say that, and we must say that the farmers' movement, as the farmers also themselves kept it a non-religious movement, they said that it's solely based on the anti-corporate agenda of this the corporate agenda of this government. It's anti-corporate protests against the 3 farm laws that were meant to privatize the farming sector, meant to destroy whatever little is left there. But at the same time, when I went to these morchas, and I'm actually mentioning this protest is because it's very interesting. When I went to the morchas, I actually saw the assertion of identity also. And I saw majorly, it was the farmers from the Punjab, the Sikh community. They are doing their own langars. Oh, the way we actually grow up seeing, how you have all your langars, you have the seva, as we say, is going on there. There are Shabad Kirtan, people are reciting their own prayers at the protest site. There was a little Gurdwara at the protest site as well. And this is also that was also the identity, the assertion of identity at the protest sites itself. And so, I mean, why I'm actually mentioning it is because I believe that even at the protest site, even to say that, we are different and we do not conform to the one identity which this government is actually pushing on everyone, one cultural identity, one cultural hegemony, one political hegemony is very important in the country right now. Slightest of difference, to maintain that difference is very important. And that is why not only the farmers' movement gave us the hope, not only the farms laws were repealed, and we saw that people movements can also very well influence the government and they can be pressurized to take a step back. But for me, it also meant that even differences can force the government to, take one step back. So nothing really, it's not really connected to the topic, but I really thought when I think of how to fight fascism, I think that fight can be fought only if we value these differences within our movements as well. Only if we recognize that we all are different, and that is what is important, and that is what needs to be preserved, is very important. And you have to fight fascism everywhere. You have to fight fascism. You are fighting it within your universities. 2 years back, when I was in university, we were trying to do whatever we could do in our campuses. And I was not in Jamia, I was in Delhi University. It's also a central university. It's a humongous university. And it's in that university, we were trying to fight it with the student organization of the current regime. Students were attacked. You hold one program, then there is a parallel program. So that's how you try. And since right now I'm a lawyer, and we try to fight fascism in courts. And how do you do it? It's, as Safura also mentioned, yesterday only, the Supreme Court, we had filed a petition in the Supreme Court asking them to expedite the hearings, it's been 2 years, and Delhi High Court was supposed to start hearing the matters of Jamia and the Delhi pogrom that happened in Northeast Delhi. And it's been 2 years, the matters are still pending before the High Court. So we went to Supreme Court, and we asked them that, see, it's been 2 years, the matters are still pending. What are you doing? Either you actually tell the people of this country and you tell the students of Jamia, you tell the minority community that you cannot do anything. And the matters are going to be pending as it's been 2 years. Now it can be 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. So luckily the Supreme Court bench, which was there.
I'm not really sure what has happened, but
yeah,
I think there's an issue with connection.
Oh.
No, it's going good. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the Supreme Court has now given 3 months time to the Delhi High Court to expedite hearing on these matters. And why I mention this is because that I remember it when Delhi pogrom happened, there was a High Court judge. The Chief Justice of Delhi High Court at that time had really taken the Delhi police at task and had played the video of the famous the BJP leader's speech, Kapil Mishra, who had actually said, and it was his speech, and after his speech, the entire pogrom had happened, who had actually said, who was standing there and there was a police personnel standing with him. So imagine in India right now, you're in such a situation that there is a leader and there is a police personnel, and that leader is actually giving a warning to the whole of the mob in front of the audience, and is actually telling the police that we give you like these 3 days, or we give you like this many hours, you now after that, whatever happens will be your responsibility. So, and just after his speech, we see the pogroms and the mob, and it was all well planned, oiled machinery where writers are coming, and there were also local people participating in that mob. They are especially targeting the shops of the Muslim community, targeting the houses of Muslim community, targeting the gullies, the mohallas of the Muslim community. So that was all well planned. And yes, so going back to that High Court judge who actually played that video and asked the Delhi police that why have you not taken any action against this man, was transferred overnight. And even now, there is a additional sessions judge who actually wrote a very, I don't know if I should say a very good order, but who actually wrote an order, and he said that Delhi police investigation into the Northeast Delhi riots, because in case is all flawed. And he said that all these police witnesses are tutored witnesses. That judge was also transferred after he gave that order. So this is how you can try fighting fascism. You try to fight it even within the courts, wherever you are, in universities, on the streets, even in your own families. You have to fight it, because right now, the times that we are living in are very dangerous times. And even within your own families, you have to confront them, because the anti-Muslim rhetoric, if I say, has gone to such level that even your own family members, would be consumed by that negative propaganda, which plays on the television 24/7. And I would say, and I don't shy away in saying that it's actually now the responsibility of the Hindu community in this country, that they should take this responsibility, and they should really come on the streets and say that it's enough, because whatever is happening in their name. It is happening in their name, and they are responsible for that. And it's their responsibility now to say that it's enough. This must stop. This cannot go in our names, because whatever the government is doing, whatever is happening in the name of the supremacist Hindu identity and Hindu ideology. So, yeah. And one thing that I actually also wanted to highlight. Yeah, just give me a minute. So one thing that I also wanted to highlight, and I think I've also taken a lot of time, much things have been covered by Safura, so I don't want to repeat it. But I wanted to highlight one thing. It is that the farmers' protest has actually shown me one way of fighting fascism, and it is that you have to come together. The solidarities have to emerge naturally. It all has to be very organic, and it has to be very organic and deep rooted. It has to be like vertical. It should cement naturally. It cannot be artificial, that in one instance you are growing and in another instance you think that you cannot stand with the community. It has to be unconditional solidarity. So you cannot say that I stand with Miran Haider, but I don't stand with Shahrzad Imam. You have to stand. And I think that is what we need in the country right now. And that is the only way through which you can fight this fascism. And I think I'll end it here, because I don't see a lot. I don't know how to really say, how do you fight fascism? Because it's one thing actually to intellectually comprehend something, but it's another thing to actually feel it emotionally and to live with it every day. And I think people like Safura, people who are right now in jail every day, it's not only those people, I also see their families, everybody. It's like you live with fascism and you're living with fascism, you're fighting it, because by existing, you are challenging them every day. Every day your existence is also a challenge. Every day your existence is also, your standing with the truth is also resistance. And yeah, and I salute all of them, everybody. And one name that I think I also forgot, Ishrat Jahan. I mean, I remember her at the protest site. So all these women, the brave women, women of Jamia, women of AMU, and the women who are in jail are actually the hope. And yeah, and I'm actually not a hopeless person, because I really believe in humans, and I really believe in the tremendous potential that people can change, people can transform. And I really hope that in our country, it's the students who have shown the way, it's the Muslim women who have shown the way, it's now the farmers who showed us one way, that how you can also apologize, because farmer leader, the Tiket, is a leader. He also has, I mean, so to say, he himself admitted he has blood on his hands. And they had a big Mahapanchayat in Muzaffarnagar, and he said that what happened was wrong. And I'm nobody to really say that if he's right or wrong. But that apology, I think, is very important to cement. And that has to be very honest. It cannot be frivolous. It cannot be fabricated. It has to come from within. And I think that was also, when I see that movement, I also believe that it's not only UP elections, or it's not only some electoral calculations, that of course the government went ahead and repealed the farm laws because of those calculations, but it is also to do with the solidarities that we saw on the ground, that there is a Sikh man, there is a Muslim man, they are together in this fight. There is also another Jat leader who once is saying I was brainwashed, and now who has come back and who is apologizing. So, and I mean, I would like to see it in that way. I can be totally wrong. I can be proven totally wrong maybe after 1 month. So, but for now, I do see it as hope. I mean, I would like to see that solidarities on the ground. That's the only way we can fight this regime today in India. Thank you.
Thank you, Gurpreet. It was a very enlightening and, and exceptionally emotionally empathetic description of your experiences, in particular with the protest side, where quite a lot of parallels have been drawn. I think it is also useful during the question and answer session to actually check what exactly are the parallels, because there are several arguments about the electoral incentives for both protests being not slightly different, but actually pole opposites. So it'll be interesting to know what is it that one can learn, also with understanding the difference in the electoral prospects. But thank you very much for sharing that with us. And as a lawyer, your view was quite an eye-opener as to the machinations of the judicial system and how the general populace continues to repose its faith, which, as Safura mentioned, is still there, but there is a huge risk with quite a lot of precedents, because a lot of things are institutionally stacked against several things. Maybe I just want to highlight, Safura, thank you for giving us a view of easily the youngest activist in town at the moment. We would welcome his appearance again. We're organizing. We would love to see your families being part of this. So at the very beginning of the session, I had the opportunity to introduce to you the South Asian Solidarity Group to you. And what I will do now is actually share with you in the chat an example of the stellar, groundbreaking, inspirational work that they have done, that many of us volunteers at Strive have had the opportunity to be part of. And a very dear friend to everybody at Strive, Sarabjit, we are very, very happy to have you with us. This is not our first time. Every time we listen to you, we learn something new, and we hope to continue this collaboration in our shared objective towards a more equitable society, a more equitable community, and asking the very, very essential and difficult questions and speaking to power. So Rabjit, it's over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Kawalpreet and Safurat. They were just amazing. And I mean, mine are very minor, small points, but I'm going to speak about the Gujarat genocide in 2002 and mention some of the similarities in strategies. And of course, the urgent need to carry on fighting for the preserving the syncretic nature of South Asian culture, fighting for secularism, democracy, equal rights and justice. Gujarat genocide, as South Asian Solidarity Group, I just want to say the genocide was, as the other two speakers have mentioned, was a state-sponsored program of ethnic cleansing, and also, of course, as shown by Final Solution by Rakesh Sharma and Suma Joshan, Gujarat, a laboratory of Hindu Rashtra. A few weeks before the genocide, similar to what happened in Delhi, there were these systematic lists of Muslim addresses were compiled by the Hindutva organizations, trident swords were distributed, martial training was given, and the BJP supported every call for a Bandh, being like a closure of all the shops and offices and everything around. And the magistrate sat quietly by while the state burned. The Human Rights Watch report, "We have no orders to save you," revealed the police were instructed not to intervene. In fact, the police were actually involved in carrying out the torturing, killing and raping of Muslims. Muslim women's bodies targeted with shocking violence, their sexual and reproductive organs attacked with a particular savagery, their children born and unborn killed before their very eyes, shown by the feminist report Threatened Existence in 2003. So it wasn't some spontaneous outburst, as we're often told in the mainstream discourse. It wasn't an outburst to avenge the deaths of Hindu pilgrims who died in a fire started when a train on its way back from Ayodhya stopped. An incident where the Muslims let the district administration to actually use their community well to draw water to douse out the fire. And forensic science lab concluded the fire could not have been started by anyone outside. Hindutva fascist gangs were responsible for so many attacks, including the Naroda Patia massacre, the largest single case of mass murder, the Gulberg Society massacre, where the trade unionist Ehsan Jafri was murdered, the gang rape of Bilkis Banu, who was pregnant at the time, and 14 members of her family, including her 2-year-old daughter and her mother, were murdered. And anyone who tried to help, Hindus, Christians, were also not spared. At the same time, the unique Islamic monuments were destroyed or vandalized. Delicate mosque screens were smashed, bricks thrown at Persian inscriptions, old Qurans set on fire. The tomb of Wali Gujarati, the grandfather of Urdu poetry and inspiration of many later poets and singers, was destroyed. This was a shrine at which Hindus and Muslims worshipped. 2 lines of a poem Wali Gujarati wrote in 17th century. Kuch aaye yaar ek kashi hai, jogiya dil wahan ka basi hai. My beloved's lane is like holy Kashi. The yogi of my heart has taken up residence there. The same pattern was established in 1992 when Hindutva armed groups demolished the 16th century mosque in Ayodhya. Then in 1998, the first national BJP-led government came to power. In Britain, the family of Syed Dawood and Shakil Dawood, the 2 British nationals burnt alive in the Gujarat genocide, are still waiting for justice, as the 6 Hindutva fascists accused were all acquitted. And so we can never forget the Gujarat genocide of 2002, when 2,000 Muslims were killed, 200,000 were displaced during that week following 28th of February 2002. When Narendra Modi, Chief Minister, a member of the right-wing Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, a political organization whose leaders glorify Mussolini's fascism, Narendra Modi did nothing to stop this genocide. Here in Britain, Hindutva forces are working hard, creating divisions in Asian communities, spreading myths of love jihad. And they're helping the state criminalize Muslim communities. 2002 was the same period when the British government was pursuing the so-called war on terror and introducing its own deeply Islamophobic policies like PREVENT and anti-terrorism laws. And they're trying to stop a law. These Hindutva fascist forces are trying to stop a law being passed against caste discrimination. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, is an open admirer of the RSS. Rishi Sunak and Alok Sharma are open Modi's followers and assistants. These people being all in government, of course. Issues like forced marriage, caste, as if they are Muslim issues, portrayed through a racist lens. Muslim culture is projected as backward and oppressive, Muslim men as violent and aggressive, and Muslim women are either oppressed or they're manipulative. The overseas wing of the RSS, Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, was established in 1940 in Kenya and set up in Britain in 1966. After Gujarati communities migrated from East Africa to Britain, they established deep roots in these communities. In the late 80s, the HSS started giving active support to Hindutva forces. They started newspaper articles glorifying Modi. They started cultural programs promoting exclusive Hindu reactionary culture. Then just before the Babri Masjid was destroyed, collections were taken in Hindu temples in Leicester, in Brent. What for? To send gold bricks in preparation to build a temple on that site. Barry Gardiner, the Labour MP for Brent, actually handed over a cheque for £1 million to Narendra Modi in December 2001, raised by Hindutva supporters here in Britain through Seva International, a registered charity. It was collected in the name of earthquake relief, but the money went straight to Gujarat in January 2002 for the genocide in Gujarat. Seva International was channeling money to a Vanavasi Kalyan Ashram, which was directly involved in carrying out the violence. Seva International could not be investigated by the charity commissioners. Why? Because the Foreign Office wouldn't allow it. These links between British government, British businesses, and India continued right through the time when Modi was banned from entering the UK because of his role in the Gujarat genocide. The ban was lifted in 2012, and when we asked him why, the British commissioner in India said, it was important for British business. The HSS in their schools here are preaching hatred of Muslims, exposed on an ITV program, saying things like, oh, the number of good Muslims you can count on your fingers. And despite all this, they're still not seen as contravening any law. These groups continue to operate as charities, but in smaller organizations, and there are so many of them. RSS members have no problems coming in and out of the country. One of their leaders, Tapan Ghosh, was invited by Harrow East, Bob Blackman, to speak in Parliament, in the British Parliament, and together they spread right-wing racist and sexist ideas. In 2016, the National Council of Hindu Temples invited the extreme right-wing Islamophobic Tommy Robinson to speak at a conference in Southall, and then it was cancelled later once we exposed them. And this all fits in with the Islamophobia of the British police. The police have linked up with these ideas of demonizing Muslim men. When the Hindu Forum of Britain started claiming that Muslim men were forcibly converting Hindu and Sikh women students in Britain, the police even announced that they will be acting against these people. And despite the fact that there was no evidence of this happening in the community, the same methods were used by the Hindu right in Gujarat in 2002, where inflammatory leaflets making these claims of love jihad were in circulation immediately before the massacres of Muslims in Gujarat. The Asian Times in Britain is funded by Hindutva money. They have regular columns by people such as hedge fund managers saying, we must have a world of Hindus across the world, just as Israel does with the Jews. There's this constant link with Israel. Israel has also funded a lot of Islamophobic material around gender and has been this has been used widely by Hindutva forces, focusing on honor killings, for example. Then, of course, there's the massive surveillance programs, the PREVENT program, supposedly counter-terrorism program of de-radicalization, actually spying on Muslim students in schools and universities. Universities have Hindu student councils and societies which are affiliated to the National Hindu Students Federation. And what is this? A UK Hindutva organization. South Asia Solidarity Group's been protesting continuously against these right-wing fascist forces. One of these has been the protesting against the British and Indian multinational corporations which back Modi and Hindutva globally. These companies plunder the land and resources of India, are being promoted by the Modi government in turn. We're part of the international movement led by the Adivasi and Dalit communities. We were part of the movement led by the Adivasi and Dalit communities in Odisha, who continue to resist Anil Agarwal's company, Vedanta, from mining on their land. Vedanta is registered on the London Stock Exchange, and it's also a funder of ISKCON, a part of the Hindutva ecosystem. We protested against Mukesh Ambani, the businessman who is waiting to take over farmland and benefit from the farm laws. Ambani is hand in glove with Narendra Modi, a big donor to the Conservative Party, and he also happens to own Hamleys, the children's toy shop right here in London. More recently, with climate justice groups we protested against Adani with the climate justice groups. He's funding an exhibition at the Science Museum, trying to present a really environmentally friendly image. And yet at the same time, we all know his coal mining companies actually destroying the lives of indigenous communities in Australia, India, and Indonesia. Another aspect of Hindutva fascism is its Brahmanical supremacist ideology. And we worked with Caste Watch UK to campaign for the legislation against caste discrimination in Britain. The Hindutva forces, with the support of MP Bob Blackman, are actively organising to stop this law. This law will give people facing caste discrimination as workers, as students, as clients, consumers of services and goods, the right to fight for justice in the courts. It's difficult to understand what the Hindutva forces are afraid of. And of course, we've been campaigning against the CAA since its inception and organized a national demonstration against the CAA in January 2020, and Strive UK also worked with us on this. Currently, we're along with a number of other groups, organizing the Nationality and Border Bill against it. The bill, along with the police bill, is comparable to the CAA UAP in India. It seeks to criminalize and strip people of their citizenship and make them stateless. It takes away their democratic right to protest. It'll affect 2 in every 5 ethnic minority person, and particularly people of India, from India and Kashmir. The bill is racist, undemocratic, and unjust. It gives more power to the border force to turn back boats carrying refugees. It revokes citizenship without any warning. It means activists, marginalized people will face deportations and disenfranchisement. As in India, it'll make it harder than ever to challenge the policies and practices of right-wing states. So let's strengthen the resistance against racism and fascism. And let's not forget the unity between Hindus and Muslims, which brought about India's First World War of Independence. In 1857, Baba Ram Charan Das, who was a Hindu, and Amir Ali, a Muslim, both leaders of the uprising, were hanged from the same tree in Faisalabad, UP, by the British. In the years that followed, this tree became a shrine for both Muslims and Hindus to remember and celebrate their resistance. Fearful of this unity, the British administration had the tree cut down. Let's support the fight for democracy and equal rights and social justice. Let's continue fighting the Hindutva forces, fascist forces in Britain too, inside and outside government. We, along with a number of other groups, are holding a protest against the Nationality and Borders Bill. Everyone is assembling at 1 p.m. outside Downing Street tomorrow in London. And there's going to be another protest on Sunday, 5th of January, when the bill is getting its second reading. And it would be great if some of you can join us tomorrow. Thank you.